My boss caught me off guard, and I couldn't stop myself from winning her heart. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't during a meeting or when she was giving instructions. It was one of those rare, unguarded moments that seem small at first, but linger in memory. The office was quiet that morning, only the hum of computers and the faint aroma of brewing coffee filling the air. I had been reviewing some reports at my desk, half-focused, when she walked past, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, the motion so natural it seemed like she was gliding. She was my boss, but something about the way she carried herself made her stand out in a way titles or hierarchy could never capture. She was in her early 40s, and there was a graceful confidence about her that came not from commanding authority, but from knowing herself completely. Her hair was pulled into a loose, effortless style, a few strands escaping to frame her face, and the faintest trace of her perfume lingered as she passed. It was warm, a little floral, subtle but impossible to ignore. I caught myself holding my breath for a moment, realizing I had been staring. When she handed me a folder, our fingers brushed lightly, an accidental contact, but enough to send a flicker of awareness through me. There was nothing overt, nothing meant to provoke. It was simply a touch that felt significant because of the weight of the unspoken. Her hand was warm, steady, and for a heartbeat, I noticed the subtle pulse beneath her skin. She looked at me then, her gaze just long enough to make me feel seen without words. That quiet, observant smile she gave me, it was like she was testing, teasing, gauging me, and it stirred something I hadn't expected to feel for a coworker, let alone my boss. I told myself it was nothing. I had seen her in passing before, had exchanged the usual polite nods and brief greetings. But this was different. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't name, a magnetic pull wrapped in restraint. Even the way she moved across the office, with her head held high yet relaxed shoulders, seemed to set the tone for the day, confident, calm, and impossibly self-assured. Over the next few moments, I found myself watching her more closely than I intended. She adjusted a file on the shelf, laughed softly at something a colleague said, and for a moment, our eyes met again. That fleeting connection, the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence, made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. I realized then that attraction wasn't just about looks. It was about presence, about the subtle ways someone could command attention without demanding it. And yet, beneath that confidence, there was something quietly vulnerable in the way she sometimes lingered over a document, or paused in thought. It made her human, approachable, yet all the more compelling. I felt an unexpected pull to be near her, to understand her better, to share more than just work-related conversation. That day, as I returned to my desk, the folder heavy in my hands, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be just another office job. Something had shifted, a quiet tension, a subtle spark, and I had no idea how far it would take me. But I wanted to find out. It didn't take long for the playful tension between us to surface. Our first meaningful interaction wasn't grand or dramatic. It was in a meeting, over a minor disagreement about a project timeline. I had suggested a slightly unconventional approach, one I genuinely believed would save time. She listened carefully, tilting her head, fingers lightly tapping a pen against the desk. Then she smiled, a knowing, almost mischievous smile that made me pause. "You're playing games?" she said, her tone light but carrying that undercurrent of challenge. Her eyes sparkled with quiet amusement, like she knew exactly what I was thinking before I even said it. I didn't miss a beat. I leaned back slightly, matching her subtle smirk. "And winning," I replied, feeling the words float between us in that rare moment of perfect timing. The air seemed to shift, suddenly heavier, warmer, charged with an unspoken energy that neither of us could ignore. The rest of the meeting passed, but I kept stealing glances at her. Every gesture was amplified in my mind, the way she adjusted her blazer, the soft rustle of her notes, as she flipped through them, the way she exhaled lightly when she was considering a point. There was something intoxicating about the combination of authority and ease she exuded. I realized, almost unwillingly, that our conversation had awakened a new level of awareness between us, one that was no longer just professional. After the meeting, We found ourselves alone in the conference room, both pretending to reorganize papers. I noticed the subtle tension in her posture, the way her shoulders slightly relaxed as she laughed at something I had said, how her eyes held mine just a fraction longer than necessary. There was an unspoken game we were playing, one of wit and intellect, of teasing without crossing lines. "Are you always this confident when you disagree with me?" she asked, her voice low enough that it felt almost intimate, the words brushing past my ear as she leaned to pick up a pen I had dropped. I felt the warmth of her presence close by, the faint perfume still lingering in the air, and my heart raced in response. "I only like to argue when I think I might be right," I said, matching her subtle tease, careful to maintain just the right level of charm. Her laugh, soft, melodic, filled the quiet room, making the world outside disappear for a few moments. It was in these small exchanges, these tiny battles of words and glances, that I began to understand her. Beneath the confidence, there was warmth, humor, and a subtle vulnerability that peeked through in the briefest of gestures, the way she would brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear, or the fleeting softness in her eyes when she smiled. It was impossible not to be drawn in, to feel the thrill of this slow, tantalizing push and pull. Walking back to our desks, our shoulders brushed lightly as we passed in the hallway. That contact, though brief, lingered in my mind, sending a quiet reminder of the unspoken connection building between us. I realized that this playful professional banter was more than just words. It was the first step in something far deeper, a slow-burning tension that neither of us could fully name yet, but both of us undeniably felt. The office had emptied out long before we noticed. Late evening sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting long stripes across the carpeted floor, softening the sharp edges of the room. We were still there, hunched over a project that refused to cooperate, and for the first time, it felt like the world outside had paused, leaving just the two of us in a quiet, charged space. She was explaining a particularly tricky detail when our hands brushed again, this time over a spreadsheet she was pointing at. It was accidental, or at least it should have been, but the warmth of her fingers against mine lingered longer than expected. I could feel her pulse subtly beneath her skin, the heat of her hand surprising me, and I noticed the almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers as she withdrew. That small, fleeting touch sent a ripple through me, stirring a nervous awareness I hadn't felt before. "I didn't realize it was going to be this complicated," she admitted quietly, her voice low and unguarded. For a moment, the sharp edge of her professional demeanor softened, revealing something entirely human beneath. There was a vulnerability there that I hadn't anticipated, a subtle openness that made her feel closer than ever. I hesitated, unsure whether to respond, and then spoke softly. "We'll figure it out together." The words felt heavier than I intended, weighted with an intimacy that was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. She looked up, and for the first time, our eyes locked in a way that didn't feel like office formality. There was curiosity there, and something more, something quietly magnetic. We continued to work side by side, but now our proximity carried a new charge. I noticed the way she would brush a strand of hair from her face, her wrist grazing mine as she did, or the way her shoulder lightly bumped mine when she leaned closer to examine the screen. These were tiny, human touches, nothing overt, but in the quiet of the near-empty office, they became moments that mattered. My awareness of her, the scent of her perfume, the warmth in her voice, the faint tremor in her laugh, grew with every passing minute. Eventually, the conversation drifted from work to life beyond the office. She spoke about a small disappointment she had experienced earlier in the week, her words soft, unguarded. I listened, genuinely, noting the subtle sadness in her eyes and the way her fingers twisted a pen as she spoke. I shared a story of my own struggles, hesitating at first, but feeling the ease of trust that had grown between us. It was remarkable how quickly the walls fell away, replaced by a quiet, mutual understanding. By the time we finally packed up for the night, there was a lingering sense of closeness neither of us could ignore. As we walked toward the elevator, our shoulders brushed again, longer this time, and I felt her warmth against me. There was no rush, no forced gesture, just the subtle recognition of something forming, a connection deeper than work, richer than simple attraction, yet restrained enough to leave us both wanting more. That night, as I left the office, I realized the shift had already begun. I wasn't just drawn to her presence. I wanted to know her, to understand her, to be someone she could rely on, both professionally and emotionally. And from the way she had looked at me, lingered in her explanations, and shared her quiet stories, I had the unmistakable sense she wanted the same. The office party was supposed to be casual, a quiet end-of-week gathering with soft music, low lights, and a scattering of colleagues laughing over drinks. But for me, it became something else entirely. The moment I saw her there, relaxed and laughing with a group of coworkers, the air around her seemed different, warmer, magnetic. She was wearing a simple yet elegant dress, the kind that hinted at her grace without trying too hard, and her hair fell loosely over her shoulders in waves that caught the soft glow of the lights. I had told myself not to overthink it, to treat it like any other office event. But the second she caught my gaze across the room, that subtle smile playing on her lips made my heart race in ways I wasn't ready to admit. There was a playful challenge in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension that had been building between us for weeks. Later, we found ourselves near the refreshment table, away from most of the crowd. Our conversation started lightly, teasing about work deadlines, joking about the poor taste in music playing overhead, but every word, every laugh, felt charged. I noticed the warmth in her presence, the way her body subtly leaned toward mine as we spoke, how her hand briefly brushed my arm when she laughed at something I said. It was so fleeting, so natural, yet it left a tangible thrill in its wake. "I can't believe you actually managed to pull that off last week," she said softly, her eyes locking onto mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Her fingers grazed mine as she reached for a glass, and though the touch was innocent, it was enough to send a jolt of awareness through me. The warmth of her skin, the subtle pulse beneath it, the gentle scent she carried with her, it all combined into a moment that felt intimate, even in a crowded room. I laughed, trying to hide the sudden awareness in my chest. "Well, you make it hard to fail when you're paying that much attention," I replied, the words deliberate but playful. She tilted her head, her gaze softening, and there it was again, that quiet vulnerability behind her confident exterior. She was showing me, ever so subtly, that she trusted me, that she valued my presence beyond the professional space we shared. As the evening continued, we drifted toward the exit together. The hallway was quieter, dimly lit, a soft contrast to the lively chatter behind us. When she reached for her coat, our hands brushed again. This time, there was no quick withdrawal, just a pause, a lingering contact that said more than words ever could. I could feel the warmth radiating from her hand, the gentle pulse of life in that small, deliberate touch. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly, voice low, almost intimate. I met her eyes, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was no rush, no dramatic confession, just the quiet acknowledgement of something forming, a connection deeper than either of us had admitted, a slow, undeniable pull. Walking her to her car, I felt the subtle charge of our closeness, every small gesture, the brush of our shoulders, the tilt of her head toward mine, layering the tension we had been building for weeks. There were no bold moves, no overt declarations, only the warmth, the trust, and the subtle thrill of first, meaningful contact. It was a quiet victory, and I knew that the game we were playing, the slow, intoxicating game of connection, had only just begun. The next week at the office carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. The playful, teasing energy between us that had felt so private during the late-night work sessions and the office party now seemed fragile, almost exposed. A small misunderstanding had started to circulate, harmless gossip from colleagues who didn't notice the subtlety of our connection but were quick to speculate. Suddenly, every glance, every accidental brush of hands felt under scrutiny. I noticed it first in the way she moved across the office. Normally confident, she now seemed slightly guarded, her posture tighter, the natural ease replaced with careful awareness. Even the smallest gestures, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, adjusting her sleeve, seemed deliberate, cautious. I felt a pang of frustration. This was not us. This was perception, rumor, the outside world imposing itself on something delicate and real. When we met in the conference room later that day to review a project, the air between us was charged with unspoken tension. I watched her hands rest on the table, fingers intertwined, knuckles pale as she spoke softly. She avoided meeting my eyes for the first time in weeks, and I felt the familiar warmth of her presence replaced by something more complicated: hesitation, worry, restraint. "You're overthinking it," I said quietly, leaning slightly forward, careful not to invade her space. My voice was gentle, intentionally calm. "It's just gossip. Doesn't mean anything." Her eyes flicked up to mine, conflicted, the briefest spark of relief mixing with unease. "It's not just gossip," she admitted, voice low. "It's perception. People are watching, analyzing. I can't ignore it, and I don't want it to interfere with what we have, even if it's just small." Her words landed in the pit of my stomach, heavy yet honest. There it was again, that combination of confidence and vulnerability. She was strong, capable, commanding respect in every room, but here, she was human, hesitant, worried about the repercussions of her emotions. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but I also understood the need for caution. We worked in silence for a few moments, the quiet hum of the office filling the space between us. Every so often, our fingers brushed across the papers we shared, tentative touches that reminded us of the connection still simmering beneath the surface. There was longing in each glance, a silent acknowledgement that despite the hesitation, despite the fear of judgment, something real existed here. Finally, I spoke softly, almost to myself. "We can't control what others think. We can only control how we treat each other, how we let this grow, carefully, slowly, the way it should." Her eyes met mine, steady, filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She nodded slightly, her lips curling into a small, private smile that made my chest tighten. That tiny gesture, subtle, fleeting, reminded me that the bond we had built was stronger than office whispers. It was fragile, yes, but real. As I left for the day, I felt the duality of excitement and tension, knowing that the connection between us was undeniable, but also understanding that the path forward required patience, respect, and careful attention. The slow burn wasn't just about desire, it was about trust, restraint, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the world seemed poised to judge. It was one of those rare evenings when the office had emptied completely, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft glow of desk lamps to fill the silence. The workday had stretched longer than usual, and we found ourselves side by side, reviewing the final stages of a project. The room felt suspended in time, the hum of the computers, the muted shuffle of papers, even the soft tick of the wall clock seemed amplified in the quiet. She leaned slightly over the desk to point at a spreadsheet, and our hands brushed again. This time, there was no hesitation, no quick withdrawal. I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle pulse of life beneath her fingertips, and it sent a quiet thrill through me. There was a delicate intimacy in that touch, small, almost accidental, yet it carried the weight of everything we had been building over weeks of shared moments, playful banter, and mutual understanding. Finally, unable to resist the tension any longer, I spoke, my voice low, almost a whisper. "You said I was playing games." I paused, letting the words hang between us, charged with anticipation. Her eyes met mine, steady but soft, her lips curving into that subtle, enigmatic smile I had come to know so well. "And you were winning," she replied, her tone equally low, equally intimate. The words were simple, yet the implication, the acknowledgement of the unspoken connection between us, carried a weight that made my chest tighten. We didn't rush forward, didn't cross lines in a dramatic gesture. Instead, there was a gentle, deliberate pause as we simply looked at each other, the room shrinking until it was just the two of us. I noticed the faintest tremor in her hand as it hovered near mine, the slight hesitation in her breath, and the way her eyes softened in a way that only someone trusting and vulnerable could allow. I reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Her skin was warm under my fingers, and for a moment, our proximity felt charged with everything we hadn't yet said. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in slightly, a silent invitation, letting the connection deepen without forcing it. There was a quiet acknowledgement in that gesture, the understanding that this moment, small and subtle as it was, marked the turning point of our relationship. We lingered like that, side by side, our shoulders brushing lightly as we returned to the documents on the desk. The conversation shifted back to work in the most natural way, but now every word, every glance, carried an undercurrent of intimacy that hadn't existed before. The playful banter of the past weeks now had depth, a resonance rooted in trust, respect, and a shared acknowledgement of desire, unspoken but undeniable. By the time we packed up and left the office, the connection between us was solidified. As we walked toward the elevator, our hands brushed again, and this time, we let the contact linger a heartbeat longer. It wasn't about a dramatic confession or a bold gesture. It was about quiet recognition, slow understanding, and the first tangible proof that what we felt was real. I knew then that our relationship had shifted irrevocably. The slow burn, the teasing, the tension, all of it had led to this moment of quiet resolution. And as we stepped out into the cool evening, walking side by side, there was an unspoken agreement. We were moving forward together, carefully, deliberately, and with all the subtle intensity that only a connection like ours could hold. The weekend brought a calm I hadn't realized I'd been craving. The city outside was quiet, the sun filtering gently through the trees as I walked toward our usual coffee spot. I knew she would be there. She had suggested meeting outside work, away from the office hum, for a chance to unwind and just exist together. There was a comforting simplicity to it, a space where the tension and whispers of the office could not follow. When I arrived, she was already seated, the sunlight catching the soft highlights in her hair, her posture relaxed but elegant. She smiled as she saw me approach, a small, private gesture that made my chest tighten in that familiar, thrilling way. There was no pretense here, no corporate masks, just her, entirely herself, and it was enough to quiet the whirlwind of thoughts in my head. We ordered coffee and found a quiet table near the window. I noticed, almost instinctively, how she wrapped her hands around the warm mug, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled. It was in these small moments, her quiet breathing, the tilt of her head as she listened, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, that I felt the depth of our connection most acutely. Conversation flowed naturally, no barriers, no distractions. We laughed at shared memories from the office, teased each other gently, and spoke honestly about hopes, worries, and dreams. The ease between us was striking, a result of weeks of careful trust, subtle gestures, and the slow build of something far more profound than simple attraction. At one point, I reached across the table, my fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief but deliberate, grounding. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest lightly against mine, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we had nurtured. There was warmth in that small gesture, a reassurance that the tension, the hesitation, the teasing games, all of it had led to this moment of simple, human intimacy. After coffee, we walked through a nearby park, the sun casting golden light across the path. She leaned slightly toward me, her head brushing my shoulder ever so gently as we walked. The touch was innocent, yet it carried the weight of everything we had shared, the laughter, the nervous glances, the unspoken words, and the subtle thrill of closeness. Every step felt deliberate, every gesture meaningful, as though we were both savoring the quiet perfection of the moment. By the time we reached the end of the path, I realized how fully content I felt. The office politics, the whispers, the hesitation, all of it had faded into the background. What remained was trust, respect, and the slow, steady bloom of a connection that had grown carefully, deliberately, and beautifully. The age difference, once a silent awareness in the back of my mind, now felt like a natural complement to the depth of understanding and maturity she brought into my life. As we paused to say goodbye, she looked up at me, eyes soft, lips curling into that familiar, private smile. Our fingers lingered in contact just a moment longer, a silent promise rather than a declaration. I realized then that the slow burn, the teasing, the tension, the quiet, meaningful touches, had reached its perfect resolution. We didn't need grand gestures or dramatic confessions. What we had was steady, real, and undeniably ours. Walking away, I felt a warmth in my chest that wasn't fleeting. It was the quiet, satisfying joy of two people who had discovered something rare and beautiful, a connection built slowly, intentionally, and with the patience and care that only true understanding can bring. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning of something lasting. 28.